Welcome to the second day or the third day of Jewish Feminisms, American Visions. I wanted to just note a little bit about the day. We had two sessions this morning. One talking about how the complications around Israel have resonated through American feminism, Jewish feminism, Israeli feminism, and world feminism. And I'm really grateful for this conversation and folks who will be part of it. Either 9 or 10 years ago, we had an inaugural convening to inaugurate the Jewish Communal Leadership Program here at the University of Michigan. This iteration of a service program, a program for people interested in working in the Jewish community in the School of Social Work here at Michigan. And I really wanted, in that conversation, for us to take on the tough questions that I knew our students would be having to encounter and having to think about. And it turned out we did have had to deal with these tough questions and challenges. And so one of the sessions was on Israel, and it was very striking that although I invited, I think, sort of brave people to be a part of it, for the most part, they weren't willing to say anything. So I think that this morning will be different, and I hope that 10 years later down the road, we realize that these are not questions that we can evade. We have to think about the impact upon our movements around, and sort of within and beyond the Jewish community, the complications that Israel brings to us, for good and ill. And then we have a session with contemporary leaders in American Jewish life, challenging feminist leaders who are also, I think, ready to help us think through some of the tough questions facing these communities, all our community and society today. So I'm really thankful to them as well, and to everybody here, obviously, for going to be part of the conversation. And then in the afternoon, for those who stay, some people have to leave at that point, but a chance to sort of process these days and these thoughts and what's going on. And actually, I want to say to everyone here and to the people who have spoken on the program, the point is not just to have these amazing conversations here, but to carry them beyond. And that, we want to take time, I hope you've taken time to sort of note down the thoughts that got generated in the conversations yesterday, and to think about sort of what form further conversations can take, further written sort of gatherings, perhaps online or elsewhere, can take. And we'll be in touch with you about that. But to really sort of keep track of, as we actually start to engage these issues, what has come up in conversation that we can then share more broadly. Okay. So that's today. Just a few notes about things coming up in Ann Arbor for those of you who will be here. This Sunday at noon, from noon to 3, the Jewish Communal Leadership Program students are leading an amazing program called The Jewish Future is Feminist, carrying on the conversations from this conference with April Baskin, who will still be in town, excitingly, Rabbi Lizzie Heidemann, from Mishkan in Chicago, and Sarah Hurwitz, who is a speechwriter, and she was a speechwriter for Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton, and someone sort of out there in the public space, but thinking really actively about what Jewish community means and Jewish identity and feminist identity. So that's going to be an amazing interactive conversation that you, if you're in town, will want to be at. In addition, following from this conference, starting today, don't run out now, there's a conference called Cartographies of Silence, a conference for readers and writers. And this is a graduate student effort called the Cliff Conference. And the keynote speaker is somebody that is precious to us, Irina Klepfish, will be speaking this afternoon at 5:30. And so in Rackham Assembly Hall. And that conference runs over the weekend. So that's today and tomorrow. So go to it tomorrow. The Women's March of Ann Arbor's Women's March is this Saturday afternoon in the Diag across the street. JCLP student Lauren Fine will be one of the speakers there. So that's going to be a great gathering, and you should go if you're not doing something else. Finally, on Sunday afternoon after the JCLP program, there's another fantastic program at Beth Israel Congregation, a film about Ann Arbor resident teacher, one of the kindest people, Irene Butter, who is a Holocaust survivor and Holocaust educator, telling her story. And Evelyn Newhouse has made a wonderful film about her that will be shown then. That's 4 to 6 at Beth Israel Congregation. So that and many other things. If you're in Detroit, there's an event on, what's that? Oh, thank you. And I didn't get the time. It wasn't, why don't we have a flyer for it? So Elisa Spiegels is performing Saturday night at Temple Beth Emeth in Ann Arbor. And that's either at 7 or 8. I'm sorry, we'll find out. But I'm telling you, you don't want to leave town. And we're very glad that we've also been able to seed some of these events happening. I want to invite Rabbi Georgette Kennebrae to come. I know we all woke overnight, as often on the news, to news that we don't want to hear, but this is particularly one that hits us hard. And thank you.
Hello. One of the things that I appreciate so much about Jewish community and humanity is that we can hold the both and. And part of our work as activists and as people is to expand that ability. And so while it is a joy and a beautiful occasion to be here these last couple of days, it was deeply painful to wake up this morning to a tragedy that has struck again. And so this morning, as we understand ourselves as activists and people who have the ability to create change and change hearts and minds, I just want to invite us to be mindful of the loss that has not only hit the Muslim population in New Zealand and around the world by connection, but each and every one of us as part of this larger global community. So at last count, there were 49 people who lost their lives last night during Friday prayers, Friday afternoon in New Zealand, many more who are injured, and potentially more casualties as a result of those injuries. So this morning, I invite us to hold that both and by first taking one full minute and just wherever you're at, paying just honor and care and sending out love to those who have been lost, their families, and to know that we have a role in helping make it different. May we know that we are united in this work. May we be strengthened today to bring all of this wisdom and how we're interconnected and how we can make change. And may we share that with others. And may all of our Muslim friends, neighbors, those we know and don't know that we're in this with them, we're here for them, and we know they're there for us. And may we be strengthened by it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I invite the first panel to come up. And
Good morning, everybody. Nothing like starting a Friday morning with some difficult conversation. I'm Judith Rosenbaum. I am really grateful to be here. This has been an incredibly just inspiring and thought-provoking couple of days. My mind is kind of on overdrive. And I am honored and a tiny bit afraid to be moderating this panel. As Carla said, I think this is a topic that is often kind of running under the current in conversations about feminism and tends to break through in often not very productive ways. And I'm hoping that we can shift that tendency today and not just talk about the complications of Israel, but complicate the conversation. I think too often when we talk about Israel and feminism, we're sort of like using Israel as a instrument of, or a weapon to beat each other over the head with. And not really digging down into the ways that this dynamic plays out in these conversations and why it's such a hard conversation to have. So I want to say a couple things to get started. One is that while I have no doubt that if we had more women at the negotiating table, we would be able to bring things to a better place in the complicated politics of the Middle East, that's actually not our job today. We are not going to be debating the politics of Israel or trying to solve the complications in the region. We're actually going to be talking about the way that conversations about Israel intersect with feminism conversations and what those dynamics are. So I just want to make sure that that piece is clear. I also want to just point out that our panel is not meant to be representative of conversations around Israel. We weren't trying to go for the full range of spectrum of positions in the Jewish community. Rather, we were trying to just have a way to drill down into some different experiences in the history of some of these debates and different perspectives on work that's happening on the ground today. We are supposed to have 4 panelists. One has not yet arrived, so hopefully she will make her way to join us at some point this morning. So we're going to start with some brief introductions from each of our panelists. Joyce is going to kick us off with some of the historical perspective that comes out of her book, followed by Letty Cottin Pogrebin, who, as many of you know, and we have full intros in the pamphlet, but Letty has been involved in these conversations for many, many years, wrote one of the first really important pieces on anti-Semitism in the women's movement in Ms. Magazine, and you can find that article on jwa.org if you're interested in reading it in its entirety, and she was part of many of the key global encounters around these issues. Ayelet Cohen is the director of the New York Tri-State region of New Israel Fund and is very much involved in coalitions that are on the ground in Israel these days. And Ruth Tsoffar, who will hopefully be joining us, is a professor of Complit here at the university and writes about Mizrahi women and gender in Israeli society. So she'll be able to share some of that as well. Yes, Marcia Friedman was supposed to be on our panel and unfortunately due to a health incident was not able to make it. She in fact actually I think is in New Zealand. Oh, she's back. She wasn't able to make it here today and we very much miss her voice and her very long historical perspective on this issue as well. Okay. Joyce, are you ready for us?
I'm here. Thank you.
I think you should probably speak from up here.
Oh. Okay. Do all those things. Thank you. There's just a lot to say, and Carla asked me to be on this panel with a little arm twisting. I said yes, and I speak as a historian. And I can say that the connection of Israel to Jewish feminism to what I call women's liberation feminism is present, if not central, not just now, but from a long time. There is a trajectory from the time I begin my book in 1967 to the present, and this trajectory is worth noting. We must learn from history. Here's my pitch: history matters. Telling the story of Jewish women, of Jewish feminists in history is itself decentering because they haven't been in the record, and this is particularly the case with the question of Israel and the story of international feminism. I won't say anything more in my opening remarks, but maybe we can say something about that later, how the story is usually told. So I actually begin my book, and I didn't intend to do this, but in 1967, two things happened. Shulamith Firestone tried to present the Women's Caucus resolutions, and she was prevented, and that led to the beginnings of the Women's Liberation Movement and West Side. We talked about that. But that same New Left Politics Conference, 3,000 people in attendance, did pass a resolution condemning the war in Israel, the 1967 war, and condemning Israel as an imperialist Zionist state. The resolution was put forward by the Black Caucus. It passed by 3-1. And it was then rescinded by the Black Caucus. But between the time that it was passed and the time that it was rescinded, Jewish women who were there felt very uncomfortable and threatened. One of them was Diane Balser, a member of Bread and Roses, who worked to eliminate that resolution. So from the beginning, from that moment of inception, there were two paths: feminism and anti-Zionism. This was a movement that really began at that moment. And if we're trying to think of another reason...
Recording has started.
All right. You didn't like what I said before? Okay. Tell you, we are censored. So that was 1967. Somebody's watching, these kind of conflicts continue. They're in my book. I never really tracked them until now, everywhere. In 1971, for example, Aviva Kanta, a name we haven't mentioned yet, but very important in the founding of Lilith magazine, and she called herself and was a radical Zionist. And in the chapter about those radical Zionists, she is at war with the Women's Liberation Collective RAT, which was something that Robin Morgan kind of took over and claimed for feminism. And that collective wrote an editorial which called for the destruction of Israel, using that words, the elimination of Israel. And Aviva wrote, "I didn't expect you, my sisters, to approve of Israel's policies, but not to call for the destruction of Israel." So the conflict over Israel was within the feminist movement. I believe the RAT editorial, the names weren't signed, but if you remember yesterday, I read from the Brooklyn Bridge group, which was the group of Jewish women trying to come to their own as Jewish women. A lot of those women were on RAT. So they were Jewish women who were calling for the destruction of Israel. 1971. 1975, the Socialist Feminist Conference. We mentioned Susan Schechter feeling the feminist movement was really not welcoming to Jewish women who they saw as supporters of Israel, and they were against Israel. So it was there. Connection was not only negative, and I do want to mention, go on, Shulamith Firestone again, and her book, The Dialectic of Sex, which gave us a vision of feminism, cooperative, collective, human rights, humanitarian, and she had visited the kibbutzes in Israel, and they were a factor in her imagining feminism. It's a different kind of Israel. Ellen Willis, who was perhaps the most important theorist of radical feminism. I love Ellen Willis, who passed in the early 2000s, and she wrote in 1977 what is considered not only a journalistic tour de force, I kid you not, but maybe the best article ever written. 3 parts, 2 minutes, never. I will stop. I didn't even get to what I'm going to say. She wrote Next Year in Jerusalem, Next Year in Jerusalem, and Ellen Willis went to Jerusalem because her younger brother, who had been a hippie, rock and roll, anti-war guy, stopped in Jerusalem on his way back from Asia and converted to ultra-Orthodoxy, and he remains an Aish HaTorah rabbi in South Africa. And Ellen Willis, the first rock critic of The New Yorker, went to try and understand what happened to him, and she went there, and Deborah Kaufman begins her book about Baal Sheva with Ellen Willis' story. She was extremely sympathetic to the ultra-Orthodox when Ellen Willis went there, and she said, I better leave Jerusalem because this might happen to me. So this countercultural hippie rock critic, radical feminism, who believed in the free expression of sexuality more than anything, as did Shulamith Firestone, was taken by the Israeli vision. 1 minute left. So I do have a chapter on this story of the UN Women's Conferences, 1975 to 1985. I know Letty will, I hope, speak about this, which was a turning point for many Jewish women who had not yet considered themselves as Jews. They could no longer see themselves as local, national, but had to be part of the international arena. The passing of the Zionism is Racism resolution in Mexico City, 1975, was a game changer for many Jewish women. It helped prepare the Zionism is Racism resolution in the UN. 5 months later, Copenhagen was even worse, a psychological pogrom, according to Phyllis Cheslin. Nairobi, that didn't pass, but still people felt threatened. Difference between how Israeli feminists and Jewish feminists felt. Israeli feminists said, so what's new? This is how they always talk about us. Jewish feminists felt threatened in a very special way. I didn't have a chance to talk about the Vilde Chaya and the war with Women Against Imperialism, a progressive grassroots organization in 1982 in the United States, which claims and urges Jewish women to become anti-Zionist. In a preview of intersectionality, you cannot be a feminist and support Israel. It doesn't matter. And DeVille de Chayes took this on. A lot more to be said. I do want to say my last 30 seconds. Whatever happened in the United States, the situation was even graver in London. And I had to keep this story out of my book because I didn't have room. But Spare Rib magazine, a feminist magazine, published an article called If You're a Feminist, You Can't Be a Zionist. Jewish women were kicked off the board. They protested, even though they were so critical of Israel. And this led to bomb threats and picketing, silencing. I visited these women just a few years ago, radical feminists who happen to be Jewish, but don't support Israel in London, feel like they can't speak. So there are many complicated issues. Sorry, went on too long.
Good morning. In the interest of and in a recognition of the intergenerational linkage that's part of this conference's theme, I want to bring to the table, if there was a table, the parents of my fellow panelists, my sister panelists. Stephen P. Cohen, there's a big difference between Stephen P. and Stephen M. P for peace. The father of Ayelet was my true north on my compass, on my political compass. Steve Cohen was a back-channel negotiator. He was clear-headed. He talked slowly, but that was because his mind was so full. He had to organize what he was going to let out into his mouth. And I want to bring to the table Judith's mother, Paula Hyman, who was the woman I commissioned to write the first piece in Ms. about Judaism and feminism. And that was at a time which clearly Joyce has alluded to, when feminism was a big tent, except Jews weren't counted in it. We weren't counted as a minority group readily. And to Joyce, thank you for making sense of my life, which really, her analytical skills are just par excellence. And so very quickly, I was born into a hyper-Zionist household in Jamaica, New York. My father was a very big macher in Jamaica, in Queens even. My father and mother were both presidents of everything you could be president of in the Jewish community. My father also was a Talmud scholar and a Baal Koreh and president of our shul for 6 years, and I was therefore the princess of the community. I sat on his lap on the bima. I was educated for 15 years in, well, make it 12 or 13 because I didn't start at birth, but pretty close, in Hebrew school, in Hebrew high school, in the yeshiva of Central Queens. So that's my early background. As a result of my parents' incredible commitment to the yeshuv, the pre-state entity, and the hunger for a state, and to the state of Israel, I considered Israel my sibling rival. My parents were there, 3-4 nights a week at synagogue for meetings. My father was very big in the ZOA, a different Zionist organization than we know today. Mort Klein's was not my father's ZOA. My mother was the president of Hadassah for the Queens County, and they were so busy with Israel that I think of Israel as my sibling rival. I didn't go to Israel until 1976, when I was 36 years old. I had already been to I don't know how many other countries. I didn't want to go to Israel. How I got to Israel and how I got to this kind of intersectionality that Joyce has mentioned. When I was 15 years old, my mother died. My father, who was the adjudicator of our practice of Judaism, he was the one who decided that he and only he could justify Talmudically why it was okay to smoke on Shabbat and put your cigarette out 3 blocks away from shul and drive to synagogue, but park 3 blocks away so it looked as if you had walked all the way there. He had a tshuva for everything. He had an answer for why this all made sense. And he who made the rules decided when my mother died that even though I was a bat mitzvah, one of the first in conservative Judaism, 1951, that I was not allowed to count in the minyan. Well, in 1955, nobody, no woman, no girl could count in the minyan. But my father made the rules in our house, and this was in our house. This was at the minyan at the shiva in our house. And we had 9 real Jews, though we had a room full. My mother's friends were women, and there were only 9 real Jews in the room, 9 Jewish men. And my father picked up the phone and called the Jamaica Jewish Center and told them to send a 10th man. So I left the Jewish we at that point and became a Jewish I. I ceased to belong to a synagogue, and in Judaism, we say, where do you belong? And we know what we mean by that, because we're affiliative people. We belong to things. I stopped belonging. I only did home-based Judaism when I married a Marxist Jew who really couldn't care less. It was entirely up to me how the sort of practice of Judaism was going to take place in our marriage and with our children. And I made my mother's Judaism, which was a Hamish, home-based Judaism. Feminism became my faith, my religion, and only when I started to report on the International Women's Decade conferences did I make that journey that Joyce describes, where I suddenly realized that I cannot define myself as a feminist, period. That I was what we now call an intersectional feminist, that I had to count my Judaism into my identity, and that I was not interested in liberating women so they could hate Jews. And my experience of international feminism became through the anti-Israel, supposedly anti-Israel positions of delegates who, by the way, were simply mouthpieces for geopolitical positions that had already been articulated in the UN in many forms, that I couldn't view these women as my sisters if they were going to say to my sisters who had come from America, we only speak to you at the barrel of a gun, we only speak to you with a dagger under the table. That isn't anti-Zionism. That's anti-Semitism. And of all the things that were happening in the world at the time, the Cultural Revolution and what it did to the Chinese, the Duvaliers in Haiti, the state terrorism in Argentina, what came out of those conferences? Zionism is racism. So I suddenly became a Jew. I mean, in other words, reclaimed the Judaism of my childhood and the Zionism of my parents. And I wrote the anti-Semitism in the women's movement piece because I felt that we were being excluded from a tent that I had helped to kind of put the tent poles in, and needed to create visibility. First of all, not all Jews are rich. That had to be corrected. I mean, we had at that point a 40% poverty rate in New York City. So that had to be corrected. And then other stereotypes, and I mentioned, I think the first evening, the stereotype of the loud Jew, so that feminism at this point in the United States, excuse me, was the feminism of the Friends Seminary. You know, it was the feminism of quiet and take your time and everyone gets a turn. That isn't the Jewish way. We are a disputatious people, we interrupt, and the best argument wins. I want to say a little bit about my dialogue work because I've been doing that for 30 years. I have been a co-founder of Palestinian Jewish Dialogue Group since 1985. Black Jewish Dialogue Group, I was in a very deeply, profoundly important group to me for 10 years. And I think that the hope of the world is humanizing at the grassroots. Before you get into the politics and the theory, you need to know the person. You need to know the person well enough that in our group we started menstruating the same time. We became so intimately familiar with each other's lives, it sort of became somatically expressed. How much more? I'm done. Sisterhood is powerful.
Good morning. I just wanted to say a word on how moving it's been to be here to see my Jewish feminist bookshelf brought to life and to be surrounded by teachers and icons and friends and to really spend these days doing wonderful learning. Judith and I were talking yesterday about the fact that neither of us can point to a moment of Jewish feminist awakening because for both of us, feminism was totally centered in the Judaism that we inherited from our mothers. And I would say for me as well, that's true about my relationship with Israel, that the awareness of the necessity of the dignity of Palestinians and fighting the occupation was totally centered within my relationship with Judaism that I inherited from my father. And if I remember my first years in Israel when I was just 2 years old, living there with my family, walking around the streets of Jerusalem with my big sister, who, you know, totally unsupervised in a Jerusalem which was much more empty, rocky fields than luxury hotels, but also a time when we learned not to pick up anything, even a gum wrapper from the street because it might explode. While my father was off in Cairo and Tunis and who knows where, trying to help create peace. So that was the Judaism I inherited. That was the relationship with Israel that I knew of. And for me, my relationship with Israel is very much an experience of family. And with it, the necessity to engage deeply and try to heal what is broken, even when it's deeply broken. I continue to be inspired by the founding promises of Israel that included a commitment to equality regardless of race, of religion, and gender. In the Declaration of Independence, it is promised that the state will foster the development of the country for all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality. of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, and sex. Promises that Israel has struggled and failed to keep. It's really a study in the ways in which a country can be paralyzed and poisoned by fear and by loss and by anger, and how painfully it can try again and again to keep those promises. It's the story of the necrotizing effect of the occupation and how it has made keeping those promises increasingly difficult and feel far away. I am younger than the occupation. I was conceived before the Yom Kippur War, a time of profound societal change in Israel, when the socialism of its founding was also falling away, and it became necessary to develop a civil society to try to keep the promises of the founders, to try to make sure that if the government was not doing the job of ensuring equality of religion, of race, of sex, that there were organizations beyond the government trying to do that work. And there emerged an incredibly strong and diverse civil society led largely by women, by feminists in Israel who understood the need to make sure that that work was being done. It was seen in the founding of the first rape crisis centers in Israel in the early 80s. It was seen in the work of Alice Shalvi and the founding of the Israel Women's Network to make sure that there were feminist organizations developing in Israel to meet the needs of women, women of all classes, of all religions, of all cultural backgrounds. And also emerging was the leadership of women in many other activist movements in Israel: social and economic justice, public housing. Women have been at the forefront of anti-occupation efforts from the beginning of Women in Black, who continue to stand every single Friday against the occupation. The founding of organizations like Mahsom Watch, women who are known both lovingly and derisively in Israel as the Saftot, the grandmothers, who wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to stand at checkpoints and witness what is going on, who have had and continue to have a profound effect on that experience. And they continue to do that work. We saw just this past December a tremendous women's strike in Israel, tens of thousands of women and their allies who walked out of their places of work to protest the failure of the government to act against violence against women. And that was a moment of true intersectional coalition, where Arab-Israeli organizations and Jewish-Israeli organizations and Mizrahi women's organizations together organized this strike. We have seen interesting movement, even in the ultra-Orthodox sector, a sector which is not remotely interested in anti-occupation activism, where women are fighting back against the limitations they experience in their pocket of society. A successful lawsuit recently against Kol Barama, an ultra-Orthodox radio station which wanted to prevent women from being able to speak on the radio, and was successfully challenged in court. Ultra-Orthodox women who want to be in municipal government and are being successful in doing that. We've seen Palestinian Israeli citizens as change agents in their communities, taking the lead on social and economic development, combating violence, and unlikely partnership among Mizrahi women and Palestinian Israeli women and Ashkenazi Jewish Israeli women trying to work on the issues in which they are marginalized, in which they see commonalities. We saw it last year in South Tel Aviv when there was an effort to pit the Mizrahi residents of South Tel Aviv against the African asylum seekers and refugees in South Tel Aviv. And there was an incredibly racist government campaign to try to pit these communities against each other, and an amazing counter-campaign led by a coalition, including Shula Keshet, an incredible Mizrahi feminist, who refused to accept that that model to say that they were enemies of each other, and actually what needed to happen was positive economic development in South Tel Aviv, and there could be allies between the Mizrahi residents of South Tel Aviv and the African asylum seekers in South Tel Aviv, and it was an incredibly powerful partnership. I want to end by just sharing with you the names of a few of the emerging Israeli feminist leaders right now who are doing such incredible work. Women like Noah Satat, a lesbian activist and reform rabbi who is helping to transform the Israel Religious Action coalition so that it's not only working on issues of religious freedom, but also anti-racism and really changing the sense of responsibility that Israeli Jews have for citizens of Israel who are not Jewish, and working against racism in the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, and trying to make sure that all residents of Israel have access to legal avenues when they are the targets of hate crimes. Women like Chagit Ofran, who runs Settlement Watch for Peace Now, an incredible organization to really track the expansion of the settlement enterprise. Women like Mushira Abudia, who is the co-chair of Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, an incredible Palestinian-Israeli OBGYN who helps to operate mobile clinics and provide access to health care for Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank. I'll stop there and just say that for me, continuing to support these incredible Israeli activists is a huge source of inspiration and strength and hope.
Good morning. I'm sorry to be late. Thank you, and this is definitely something to build on. So thank you, Carla. Thank you, Judith. I will divide my short comments, into three parts: the imagined community of Israeli feminists, the Arab-Jewish limited space of feminism, and 2 or 3 examples that respond to current issues of gender politics. So we can say that Israeli feminism starts with a sweeping, all-encompassing promise of utopic equality, as you said. The new Israeli Jewish woman will be Zionist in the kibbutz. She will thrive on a collective socialism rather than simply engage with the reproduction and family life. She will be producing, like her husband and the rest of the kibbutz, if she has a husband, a new society, redefining institutions such as patriarchy, motherhood, food and feeding, etc. The myth of equality was intensified by the melting pot ideology, kibbutz galuyot, or the ingathering of the Jews, and the ethos of assimilation, complementing the shared tradition of Jewish history, the language of the Bible, and the law of return. Together, they portrayed a new society with equal degree of inclusion and belonging to all in a fair, accelerated project of building and being built, what we call integration. We must add to this illusion the mandatory service of young women in the army and the unionized socialist women organizations of the time, fighting women and fighting for women's rights. The Israeli women is a new brand, secular, free, vital, productive, and highly spirited. She has a unique voice and a strong body. Just to add to it, there are many historic factors that play into this illusion. Ben Gurion, for example, made things worse. He insistence to establish a democratic state that is also Jewish deepened the power of the religious patriarchal grid in its institutions and especially halachic legal system. It tied forever issues of nationality and citizenship with issues of family and personhood, providing limited space for negotiation for women with the system. And as Ayelet said, the impact of these issues on personhood is increasingly a burden for women, and sometimes there are no solutions. The frustration, the lack of solution. Myth of equality comes with a high price. False consciousness, blind spots, systematic distortion of reality, and a major gap between the imagined and the real. You can say this is like one of the big diseases that not only women think about themselves as women, but of Israeli society. Within such a paradoxical national construction, issues of difference, gender, ethnicity, minority, sexuality, along with disability and class, are assimilated. So difference is assimilated, and women are erased, they become invisible, muted, and disappear under the ethos of homogeneity. So the subject of imagined feminism is a layered, complex, seductive, and extremely problematic within the unique configuration of state and citizenship. Indeed, during the 70s, following the Yom Kippur War, in addition to importing and translating American and French feminist literature, and at its early stage, it was very much imported. Israeli feminists had to dismantle this consciousness and still have to do that and engage in how to undo and survive the equality bluff. The ramification of life with the myth, however, are far-reaching, especially evident in the performance of the phallic rape culture. Under occupation, but also not just because of occupation. Occupation is an important aspect of, but of course the fact that women had to go to the army and participate in the army, and the level of militarization of culture add to it. So to be a woman in such reality is difficult, perplexing, but to be an Arab Jewish Mizrahi woman is doubly problematic. And even more if we add to these restriction matters of class, education, and so in addition to being erased and invisible, there is a major dilemma or tension between the celebration of intersectionality and the emergence of coalition of women and the incredible ability to move forward, and the way that violence and politics reduce women, reduce the gender paradigm into binaries, unable to move from these binaries of women as women, very reductive, in a way that the intersectionality and the coalition idea doesn't work. So especially for Mizrahi women that are always, you cannot be Mizrahi and leftist or Mizrahi with other variant. It's always very reduced, and the location of culture is very clearly defined. So the impact of these historical details on current gender construction is huge, and I'm emphasizing the past and the imagined feminism as a way that really guides the collective consciousness. There is a sense of celebration, while at the same time there is such a strong sentiment against feminism and anti-feminism, together with anti-intellectuals, anti-leftist, anti-academic, that is very destructive to the possibilities of emerging new imagined possibilities. Violence that target women, like all acts of terrorism, reinforce the binaries. It reduces the paradigm, and in general, what Ayelet was talking about, the declaration of a state of emergency when women Nashim Osot Historia, Women Make History, went on strike to mark the murder of women. So murder and homicide become very much normalized in the Israeli reality. In 2018, 24 women were murdered, and continuously it kind of occupies the headlines of the papers. So in addition to Nashim Osot Historia and Nashim Osot Shalom, these are coalition of women that try to bring together women from all aspects of life, Bedouins, Palestinians, Israelis, and different ethnicities and different class. In addition to all these attempts to create coalitions and to the emergency that created by violence and the real literal need to go to the streets, we also experience other projects that are more private and intimate in attempt to bring together different ethnicities, especially in the context of ethnicity, and compensate for the historical gap and historical erasure. So for example, משמרים את השפה העיראקית is a website in Facebook that attracts 60,000 people to its participate. It's preserving the Iraqi language that was organized by Zehava Bracha, who with huge passion to the language, and in which people from different countries, including Iraq, and writing in Arabic, participate in discussions on language, sending food recipes, and kind of becoming a cultural archive that solidify language and meaning, and how to keep the meaning of language alive in spite of the attempts to forget it and erase it. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you all. So I want to just pull out a couple threads because we've covered a lot of different ground. So I think first of all, one of the things that we can hear in these comments is that this is an issue that has a very long history. The history of Israel and feminism and the relationship between the two and the conflicts that emerge has a very long history. And I think that that's really important for us to remember, that in the issues that we're facing today, this is not the first time that feminists are struggling with where Israel politics fits into feminist politics and where feminism fits into Israel, and where Jews fit into feminism around some of these issues and beyond. So I want to kind of call attention to that because I think part of what we can do is try to learn from that. I also want to point out the real insufficiency of language here, and I think often we get very trapped by language. So, for example, we've already mentioned the fact that we don't really know what we mean when we say Zionist, right? There's a Zionism of the ZOA of one period and of today. There's there's Zionism as defined by people who use the word occupation, and there's Zionists defined by people who don't, right? So, and that is certainly true with many terms that come up in these conversations. We've already seen that there's a very slippery relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Sometimes we use those terms indistinguishably. Sometimes we really can't do that. So I think that there's just a problem around language in general, and I see this all the time in debates around Israel. What does pro-Israel mean? What does anti-Israel mean? What does anti-Zionist mean? We don't really know what any of these terms mean, and when we use them, we confuse matters more than make distinctions. I also want, and we've talked a little bit about feminism in Israel as well, and I think that also pushes us to think about the ways in which we have conversations about feminism in Israel that are based here and conversations that are based on the ground in Israel and in Palestine. And I think there are a lot of issues around, or insights around intersectionality that come up when we actually take the conversation beyond the American context and look at people who are feminists doing work on the ground in another place, right? So, I want us to think a little bit together now about some of these questions around how we distinguish between terms and how we use language and how we can talk about these things when language feels so problematic. And I think this also isn't unfamiliar to feminists in general, right? We have, as we've talked about over the last couple of days, there are so many ways in which we've kind of defined ourselves more and more narrowly to try to hone in on what our politics really is and what our vision is of how change happens. And that can be clarifying. It can also be divisive in various ways. The other thing I want to mention that I didn't say before is that we also saw in these comments that there is often a gap between our utopian dreams and what the reality looks like. And that is a very hard and painful thing to grapple with. And again, a huge theme within feminism writ large, right? There's the vision of what we're working towards, and then there's what it looks like as we're trying to do that and all the ways in which we fall short. And how do we grapple with that as feminists, right? How much can we keep that utopian dream in our eyes front and center, and how much, when do we need to say that's not actually what we're talking about anymore? So I would love to talk a little bit together now, if we can, for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, about how we can learn from some of the work that's been done in the last 50 years or so around feminism in Israel, around coalition building, around trying to parse some of these debates that might be applicable to this particular moment where we're struggling with this more around intersectional debates within the feminist community here. Can we use this one?
Start with that. Is that on? This one? Okay. Go ahead. No, the big one.
Oh, it doesn't seem to be on.
It's not on. Hello? Hello? Here you go. Letty,
Okay. May I be heard in the back? Okay. It brings to mind for me, the first time I went to Israel in 1976, it was at the behest of the Israeli government because I had helped to organize a petition against the Zionism is Racism resolution that came out of the Mexico City conference in 1975. And so a group of us were invited. This was Hasbara at its best, public relations from Israel, from the Israeli state as its best. They invited this group who had organized this petition campaign to go to Israel, and they showed us everything you would imagine for you to fall in love with Israel and for you to see the threat. We were standing up in the Golan, and we looked down into a daycare center, and this is where the Syrian rockets hit or could hit little children. And you go home and you say, oh my God, we have to build the army, and all of the sort of normal reactions when you've been shown a threat and you've been shown the glory of technical advancement and, noblesse oblige and all the handsome young IDF soldiers, then both sexes that you were introduced to. I came back and I said, I need to get Ms. people to see this. So I put an ad in the magazine that said, our sisterhood is going to Israel, as opposed to all the sisterhoods of all the synagogues that were kind of doing strawberry luncheons to raise money for the JNF. So our sisterhood is going to Israel, and 52 women and 6 men signed up. And I planned an itinerary for them with the help of feminists on the ground that I had met the first time around in 1976. Mind you, no email, no Google, no faxes, and only long-distance charges on the phone and airmail letters. So it took nearly a year to just plan this trip and to get people in place. The reason I tell you that is that the very first or third day, and it was after the beach landing that killed the woman who was a photographer on the beach in Tel Aviv. It was a terrorist attack. We had a group come to the basement of the King David Hotel that included Leah Tzemel. Does anyone know Leah, who was a Palestinian rights lawyer? Alice Shalvey, Ramonda Tawil, who was an organizer, allowed, because she was a relative of Arafat, to actually cross the Green Line, and somebody from Witzo. I mean, the most incredible cross-section for that moment in time, at a moment when somebody had already been killed and a bus had been blown up. Okay, so that was the embodiment of the Israel-Palestine problem, though Palestine, you weren't allowed to call Palestine at the time, at that moment in history. And we did our work anyway. It's just like Women of the Wall, who put together in 1988 at the first international and last international Jewish Feminist Conference in Israel, went to the wall and found a way to create a service that answered the needs of the Orthodox among us and, you know, the most airy-fairy spiritualists, pardon me, among us. But it satisfied the spiritual needs of the cross-section of women who came to the wall as a historical site and also as a religious site, arguing, no, it shouldn't be a religious site, but also honoring those who felt it was a religious site. To me, that is the embodiment of what women do. We find ways to link ourselves. There was a moment when women did a hand-in-hand, organized a hand-in-hand that went all the way around Jerusalem. We have women, what's the name of the group? Women Waging Peace now, who refuse to have an agenda. They refuse to be forced into any of the language of, well, what about boundaries? What about Jerusalem? What about right of return? They refuse. All they say is, back to the table. You've got to get back to the table. And they're saying women should be at the table, but, you know, they don't even want to say, before we'll support anyone, you have to have 1/3 women. They just say back to the table. Stop this inertia, you know, which is a weird sentence in itself. So I just want to highlight that capacity. The ideal for me, the utopian ideal in feminism that is so reflected against the backdrop of Israel-Palestine politics. It's right there, written at the wall or written in that table of people who could nonetheless get together and speak after a terrorist attack that killed somebody.
I think for me, I would say, I think one of the least productive impulses that we're seeing so much now are red lines and moral purity. To say, if you don't renounce Israel, you can't come to the table. If you, support BDS or sit with anybody who supports BDS, you can't come to the table. That is incredibly unproductive. And I think related to that is the competition of who has suffered more, which is as productive as whose is bigger, and as ridiculous. I think that when progress has been made and when we see it made, it's about unlikely people sitting down together and recognizing each other's humanity and being willing to know that there is tremendous suffering in our histories, and there needs to be a tremendous will to move forward. And we see that in these incredible, unlikely partnerships, like Rabbi Damlin, one of the founders of Parent Circle, the Bereaved Families Coalition, people who have suffered tremendously, people who have complicated histories, people who, Jews who grew up in the settlements who are now committed to anti-occupation work, and Palestinians who committed terrorism who are now committed to nonviolence. This is where the possibility lies, and this is why whose is bigger and red lines are not going to get us anywhere, but sitting down and recognizing humanity and believing in the necessity of moving forward is essential, because the people that we're talking about who are in it do not have the luxury of despair and do not have the luxury of moral purity. And so for us to be so pure that we turn around and walk away isn't helping.
Judith, I'd like to comment on your comments as an academic activist, if I might. And about this question of language, I want to raise the question of narrative, and to say that, whose narrative, whose historical narrative is this? Letty, you spoke powerfully about how you became a Jewish feminist because of the Zionism as racism resolution after Mexico City. So let me tell you that in the world of women's history, which I live in with part of myself, that is not a narrative that is discussed or welcome, and the narrative there, which is a true narrative, is that these conferences, these conferences, the UN Women's Conferences, allowed for the universality and triumph of international women's rights. It was a time when Western dominance was downplayed and the third world, the global south, became triumphant. The question of Zionism and Jewish, who cared about that? And let me tell you that a couple of years ago at a conference of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, which is the biggest conference in this field, thousands of people come every 3 years. I have often been called by the organizers of this event saying, oh, we have no Jewish panel. Carla, you remember this. They turned down all the Jewish panels, you know, thousands of sessions, and then there aren't any. They called me, would I do something? Yes. But some years ago, there was a double session on the UN Women's Conferences, a double session. So maybe it was 6 hours, 8 or 10 panelists, and this became a special issue. And the panelists was supposed to talk about tensions and conflicts at the UN women's events. 6 hours or 8 hours, not a single word about Israel or Palestine. I mean, I sat in the back, I thought I'm not gonna make it, I'm gonna have a heart attack. You know, my hand was up, a question was not held. I mean, so this is not part of, it's very difficult if you're in the feminist community as an academic, you know, to try and make sense of this story when nobody wants to listen. Okay, so that's one thing about language and narrative. In terms of coalition, so what can I as an academic scholar do? Maybe a little bit different than what you talked about, but just a couple of months ago, I started at Brandeis, a collaborative, we call it American Jewish Feminist, Israeli Feminist, Haifa Israeli Feminist Archive Collaborative. It highlights the feminist work of Jews in the United States, Jewish feminists, but the Haifa Feminist Center, Isha Lisha, led by Hannah Safran, our partner, refused to use the word Jewish to talk about the wonderful work they're doing, because they collect the papers and do other kinds of work with Arab feminists, with all kinds of feminists, completely a volunteer organization. And we now have a collaboration where we are supporting with money and funds wherever we can. And this is an open collaboration. We're looking for other partners. If you're part of a university, if you're part of anything, would like to, you know, help the work of archives in Israel. For some reason, I don't understand. Israeli universities and governments are not interested in preserving the papers of women. I can't understand why. But even Women at the Wall came to us to say, can you take our papers? They can't find anybody in Israel, any libraries to take their papers. So one way that I, as a historian, can try to engage this situation is to promote a collaboration between American feminists and others who are interested, and Israeli groups. If anybody is interested, we are open for business. And I do want to say the first collection that we're highlighting, in addition to Lilith, which is there in the Brandeis archives, is Marcia Friedman. Marcia Friedman, who can't be with us, was the first feminist member of the Knesset and made powerful speeches in 1975 at the time of the Zionist is racism controversy, where she talked about the feminist vision as a vision of one world. She talked about Arabs and Jews. This is a feminist vision. And so her papers are in both collections, and it's one way that we could think of collaboration as scholars.
So the question of language, really critical, and especially in a climate that language carries so many layers of meaning and has been metaphorized and used and abused in different contexts. So how to strip all this metaphoric level of language to come to a place we all speak it in the same codes, in the same reference system. It's very complicated, but if possible. But the idea is really how to continuously ask the question and continuously diversify the language, problematize meaning, and allude to the different possibilities that language produce: horror and fears and elation and feeling that we are together, even if it's based on a false idea. So one of the invitation is not just to talk about it, but for all of us to continuously be engaged in issues of language and know that it's an open question. It's not something that we can, what is a Zionist? What is an anti-Zionist? What is anti-Zionist in the context of NYU or in the context of a development town in Israel or in the context of Tel Aviv? And what is, it's interesting because for many years we use the word olim chadashim, like new immigrants. Now it's starting to be more comfortable to talk about immigration, me'agrim, and to think about immigration in the context of aliyah was just because of the language and what it means in the context of Israel was kind of a taboo. Right? Why do you speak about immigration? Talk about olim, right? This is the, but there is a whole vocabulary in Hebrew that is connected and reinforced by occupation, but vocabulary like what is safety? What is terrorism? What is horror, right? All kind of question. So it's a lot about extent, how much we need to be safe in order to be safe. What does it mean to be good and moralistic in different systems, right? But again, the desire to against the desire to exclude women from and Israeli women from the public spaces, the exclusion from buses, from classrooms, the divide of gender that is now being advocated by different politicians and has such an incredible support in the public, is really a practice that tells us that language is on a spectrum of action. So the performance of gender and the language of gender are very much, the threat of language is very much and very real, like the action and the legal result that come from this language. So it's critical to look back at language and see how to continue. And I'm not coming to give a suggestion, it's a very theoretical question, but really how to be engaged and engage others in this endless question.
You know, I think one way to make it less theoretical is really when we're in these conversations, and this depends on the ability to have relationships, as Letty mentioned, but to even just be able to ask, what do you mean by that, right? Because that brings it down from a certain narrative level to a different one that requires us to define our terms more.
And maybe maybe to pay attention to different conversations and to realize there are conversations that close the possibilities of dialogue, and there are conversations that open dialogue, and to really make a distinction where what we say and what we hear end the dialogue and there is no any way to continue and develop ideas, and where it allows more possibilities and really kind of developing.
So on the theme of opening the dialogue, I'd love to be able to take some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. Oh yes, Rima Hassone. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Palestinian, and I wanted to begin with a very deeply personal perspective about the Zionism is racism. Years ago, I had a very good friend. She was an American Jew. Her father was a rabbi, and we had a very meaningful relationship, friendship. And I remember the Zionism is racism statement came up between us, and she could not understand why I entirely felt championed by that statement. I, as a Palestinian who had grown up in the Middle East, feeling quite, criminalized as a Palestinian. And it was really a breach between us. She felt it was a very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic attack, and it was a really deep wound in our friendship. I begin with that because one thing I really want to bring into the conversation is I'm deeply troubled by a division between Israel and the occupied territories. I really want to bring in Palestine into this and bring us way before even 1948. I'm very interested in Jewish feminisms, whether Israeli, North American, or European, that begin to tackle, that begin to confront the really hard work about the ground, the ideological, political, real ground, the material ground, spiritual ground that Israel lies on at the expense of the violation of Palestinian life. I don't even want to just say rights, I want to say life. My family is a legacy of that. My father was a refugee. And I really, it's a very difficult matter, but it's very important. I'm not interested personally in saying it's difficult and walking away from it. I'm also not interested in saying language is hard, and I'm interested in sometimes fixing what we mean, because there's so much at stake for all of us. So I really wanted to bring Palestine into this. And I'm very interested in hearing how you, people in the room, tackle that. How do you celebrate Jewish life and yet deeply, deeply challenge what is done in the name of Jewish life? So.
I will try to answer that one. I don't believe Zionism is racism. However, I believe the current government's kind of Zionism is racist. I believe the current government is responsible for apartheid roads in the territories, the occupied territories. I believe the sidewalks of Hebron are apartheid. I believe Palestinian suffering is erased in the narrative of everyday life in Israel. I believe the blurring of the green line is a tragedy. I was on the White House lawn. I don't know if you're a two-stater or a one-stater, but I had a moment of sheer ecstasy to sit on the White House lawn when I was president of Americans for Peace Now here and watch the handshake and believe that the new Middle East, as Rabbi put it, was heralded that day. And watched Palestinian Americans and Jewish Americans meet in the executive office building to build the new Middle East, to create telecommunications and student exchanges and new businesses. And I thought I had seen the future. But I had underestimated the backlash, the power of the ultra-right in Israel, and here, the rise of evangelical support, the so-called evangelical Zionists. All of the unraveling that we who've been at this for so many years with a belief that two peoples can achieve self-determination in this same land that both have entitlement to and both love. The understanding of the love that Palestinians feel is that it's the same love we feel, that the dream that we say next year in Jerusalem, they have the key on the wall for their house that was taken over. The understanding of all those parallelisms doesn't seem strong enough to overtake the rise that we've seen in all countries, and certainly in Israel. And I have to say the failure of the Palestinian government. I mean, I have met with enough people in Palestine to know that they're disappointed in their own government. So the failure to articulate really a positive vision, terrible word, vision, all of that I think we underestimated. We underestimated the power of making human the Palestinian cause. The failure of that, we underestimated how the alternate narrative that they have always wanted to shove us into the sea, and therefore, you know, Eretz Yisrael, Shlema, we need all of Israel to be safe. The complexities on the ground there are so contradictory to the ideals that we who have been working on these issues have had. We used to have people inside the Knesset, so the extra parliamentary activism had its mirror image, and we could then, and we had, you know, coalitions with Arab parties. We had opportunities that don't exist anymore. We're lucky if we're going to get 6 labor people in, and who knows where labor stands anyway. And Meretz is not, you know, the whole move toward the right that changed the center, where the center is, the whole inability to even use the word peace and democracy in this stupid nation-state law. Who could have anticipated any of that? So what you're asking us to do is what I have lived through in dialogue, is to make Palestinian reality, to center it as much as we need to center our own dreams. That's so like pie in the sky now. I mean, we're dealing with these realities makes us sound, you know, like ingenues, sort of. And that's been the disappointment of my life. I mean, we were saying on the way over, you were saying how sad it is that my generation has to go out. I'm not saying we're all dying, but we're going to start dying one after the other, and we face it, let me say. that we who have worked so hard on so much of this have watched it just roll back down the hill. And, you know, you have to push the rock now. It's up to you to push the rock, but it's going to be so much harder because we've seen the mountain. We got so close, and it hurts so much to see how far back we've slid and how much more powerful our enemies are. I really wish I could be more hopeful.
I just wanted to say a word about, you know, I agree it's very important to acknowledge that this is not something that started in 1967, that the deep connection of both Jews and Palestinians to the same piece of land is millennia old, and that it is incredibly important to be aware of the deep religious and historical connection of both peoples to that land, of the modern political tragedies that unfolded one after the other, and that you know, that same moment I was talking about in 1948, which was for Jewish Zionists a moment of miraculous achievement, was Nakba for Palestinians, and that the founders of the State of Israel, who I think understood that it was a moment of political opportunity to found a state that was the realization of millennia of Jewish longing for Zion, and you know, at that point, half a century of modern political Zionism, were in different places politically, and I think exhibited a combination of tragic naivete and total disregard for the Palestinians who were living in that place, and completely failed to understand that the war that was clearly brewing would result in huge numbers of Palestinian refugees from that land. They were very focused on their own experience, and we are dealing with the consequences of that daily, and I think absolutely it is important to name that, and that needs to be part of our awareness when we have these conversations.
Another question?
Thank you, Rima. I hear you. I think I hear you. I think one of the, I'm coming from comparative literature and the role of narratives, and going back to narratives and language, and how narrative and the media and the cultural discourse can help in making it easier, or giving permission to the public and to people to listen. because one of the problems is that, like in my class, a Jewish student will come to me when we do Palestinian narrative and say, I feel just by reading it, I betray my people. And there is a way in which entering emotionally into this space of the other is not permitted by the rules of reading, the rules of the culture. And how do we change this permission to see the human aspect of the other, so it's not always covered and layered in a way that we cannot see them. So how to hear better, how to see better, how to make it more available with this permission through narratives. And what's the role of narrative on TV? It's like I hear Israelis say, oh, there was a TV and this one is Palestinian, but he's a different Palestinian. Or usually they will use the word Arab and not Palestinian. But there are different Palestinians, they are more intellectual, and how to actually develop more in this so there is less burden of representation on individuals and making it really part of the whole discussion, so there is less competing narrative on pain and who is suffering more, but really seeing and listening, learning to listen.
So we're going to collect a few questions at once and then do some quick responses because we're running out of time. So Marla, Karen, April. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Karen McGinnity, I'll talk quickly. So in 3 weeks, I'm going to the University of Kentucky. In 3 weeks, hello. Okay, in 3 weeks, I'm going to the University of Kentucky for an international Me Too symposium. And I'm anticipating, although I've been assured that I am not the token Jewish feminist there, I'm still anticipating that I might encounter some of the issues that have come up during this session. And what I'm wondering is if some of you could reflect on, and I'm thinking of you, Ruth, but all of you really, if you could reflect on how we might be able to use the Me Too movement as, in a positive way, as a vehicle to engender greater understanding of the multiple narratives about the Middle East, about Israel, about Palestine, and about how we can all women, all genders move forward in ways that are productive and healthy and increase understanding and bring us closer to peace.
Marla Brutschneider, thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much for your question. So if anyone can speak to this, but also in terms, Carla, of longer-term conversations or what we might do, I want to also just invite anyone to talk with me or create some sort of conversation activist group to think about. So I see my role as trying to support a variety, people who are having a variety of strategies and a variety of politics and visions working on this, because heaven help us, anything I ever thought was the right one was not necessarily the right one. So remembering as feminists our commitment to multiple strategies, and also to gather feminists and queer feminists to look at some things I've learned from the Jewish perspective of anarchists long saying that to invest in structures of statehood are inherently going to bring certain kinds of problems. And a lot of us who ended up even still saying, okay, this historical moment post-Holocaust, I'm willing, I'm gonna back this one because right now that's all there is. So I'm feeling very also conflicted with the outstanding critique of sometimes the reactionariness of impossible visions, but also as an anarchist, I'm completely committed to impossible visions, because otherwise what are you going to do, right? So on that note, I want to just invite long-term, please feel free to share all your wisdoms, but how a Palestinian state, visions, if you can put them into practice, that's fine, but how a Palestinian state, how a one state, etc., some of our ideas of how we can not replicate the endless problems we've had of multinational states, because the modern state is a modern sovereign nation state, and it's always been effed up, and it's never worked. And then two states, why a Palestinian state would fare any better with all the structural inherent problems of modern statehood, international capitalism, and, and militarism. So, if people want to have real conversations, that some people can act on it right now, and some people will take a little bit of that breathing room to work on the impossible visioning, which sometimes helps. Anyway, I invite that for longer term.
Heather and then April, just so people know.
Just to note, we're out of time, so.
It's out there as a starting place.
You can tell by the level of responses to this panel, even compared to all of the other wonderful panels, is an indication of how fraught this issue is, how much of our lives have been both invested and affected by it. In part, I then want to appreciate the both passion and ability of the panel, this wonderful question, and the engagement of genuinely seeking answers. I have a concern that has been troubling me since before I came to the conference. It may not even fit at this panel, but I realize our time is dwindling, and it may fit more even into the next panel, but I at least throw it out as a question that is fraught for me and for many of us. The tensions in part around Israel, Palestine, around Judaism and anti-Semitism, around racism and having a unified society in which all people are treated with dignity and respect. All those issues at this moment, we all know, are coinciding in the internationally, certainly, and in the domestic sphere. At a time of amongst the greatest peril in our lives in the domestic sphere, not ignoring, it's also in peril internationally. But these issues are at the flashpoint, amongst the most important flashpoints, and will be used as a wedge to divide us, if not destroy us. Last, it's taken on a partisan tone, in addition. Last night, there was a GOP fundraising letter that went out that said Democrats, maybe getting the words wrong, but Democrats hate Jews or something like that, and, or anti-Jewish. It wasn't just anti-Israel or anti-Jewish. And so give us a lot of money for, I don't know, Mitch McConnell or whoever it was. It's a serious enough problem. It comes up in different flashpoints. And all the issues, all these different issues get merged. It is hard enough to even separate which ones we're discussing, because there is a history to it, to all of it, and to all of us as we enter into it. And other than just saying it, I mean, I partly came to the conference hoping, are there ways to get a perspective on this, of how do we bridge this, or how do we live with it? How do we not destroy ourselves with this? How do we move forward so there is another day to envision another reality? I actually thought that some of the points that Ayelet made, what, am I saying the wrong word? Ayelet. I like Jewish, I don't understand English, I don't know. But the provided some guidelines that I hadn't really seen written. I feel like we need common tools to deal with this moment of our greatest uncertainty. And we each may be collecting different, I realize I've gone over my time, and so collecting different, I brought about 6 different articles, thinking if it comes up, I can quote from this one and this one and this one, but I don't have a tool. I don't have the right tools, but the comments of recognizing each other's humanity. We each had enormous suffering, the necessity of moving forward together. We don't have the luxury to walk away. Just, there's some, anyway, I raise as a question for the Jewish community and the Jewish feminist community, with the wealth of tools and brilliance that we have here, and the organization from Lilith and Jewish Women's Archives and other groups that will move on from this, from today. if there's some joint progress that Jewish feminist voices can bring to this moment of both great peril and incredible inspiration, because there are so many people who want to help us to find ways to move forward. I'm not expecting that there's an answer, but I am raising a plea that I think many of us have in our hearts, and a will, as you were saying, to work forward for how we move forward from this day, because the issues are not going away, and we are not going away.
We can count on Heather Booth to very effectively articulate the adaptive opportunity and challenge in this moment. So thank you for that. And truly thank you, because you gave me some insight about some things that I'm working on. This is what I spend day and night thinking about. It is exactly what you were talking about. I know we're over time. I have a question. I don't even know if you're going to have time to get to it, but I really want to name it. Particularly in a space that is so respectful of Jewish people, because it's often what I'm about to ask are facts or information that I have that I'm not even 100% certain about, that are often used as weapons against our people. And I think in this space, particularly in a feminist Jewish context, I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts about it, which is that as a Jewish woman of color, I have been particularly moved by Ethiopian Israelis and Mizrahi Israelis, particularly Yemeni Jewish women, who, it's painful for me as a Jewish woman who loves her people. I think terms get complicated, and I know we're out of time, so I would love for there to be either, I would love to hear thoughts shared, or it's hard for me, the erasure that I see and experience around the ways in which Yemeni women and families have been treated, and Ethiopian women at times have been treated in terms of the medical system and their children. And I long for a time when we as a Jewish community can talk about that. I think one of the challenges is the either-or dynamic of white supremacy culture. And I hold that we can be a remarkable people and a remarkable country and do very deeply painful and oppressive things that until we address it. Anyway, so I long for somebody to talk to me about that, because when I raised it with Jewish male leaders in the community, I got a wall of silence, and it was heartbreaking.
Okay, are we taking more questions, or can we, Irina, and then we're going to try to wrap this up in some format.
I just wanted to add and to ask what, in terms of trying to change some of the way we talk about things. I'm always very disturbed by the pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian label, so that when humanitarian aid is being sent to the Palestinian, it's always described as a mission that's pro-Palestinian. It's never sort of described as humanitarian, and I wonder whether that could possibly be changed. And the other thing I wanted to ask also about vocabulary, nobody on the panel mentioned the terms non-Zionist or post-Zionist. And I think that did I miss it? No. And I'm, oh, okay, no, because I think this pro and anti-Zionist is one of these things that you were talking about, Ayelet, about red lines. And I'm wondering if there's another kind of vocabulary that could be used that would not be seen necessarily anti-Semitic automatically, even though I don't think anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitic, but at least that there are these other terms that you never really, rarely anyway, see in the press or in dialogues, and I'd like to introduce that as partly also as a kind of new vocabulary.
Just to say that Ellen Willis put those terms forward, and I really do end my story right there.
But you rarely see, I mean,
we didn't talk about it.
No, not just here. You don't hear about it very much. There was a period where post-Zionism was sort of popular, and then it disappeared.
Right, people are more comfortable with language that is more polarizing because it makes things seem simpler. And I think the overarching message we get here, obviously, is that it's not simple. There are no answers. We can't contain this within an hour and a half long session. I can give people the opportunity to share some words of hope in a couple of seconds, but I think the questions that really you all have posed have to do with the need for continued conversation. I think the hopeful thing I can say is that I think feminism supports that, right? Feminism is not it's not expiring, it's not a time-bound project. It is an ongoing life approach and project, and hopefully re-energizes itself because we are working as a collective and drawing on each other's energy and able to, create something generative that comes out of that. The questions that we got, just to recap very briefly, are about these like moments of hope. What might be opportunities? What are the things that are constantly undermining us, like trying to hold on to certain notions that we have never seen succeed, like nation states and all of that, and whatever utopian dreams we might have about reinventing that. How we think about this in the larger context of all of the things that endanger us, how we can confront the things that are really hard. I pose to you, for those of you who are willing to do this in literally 30 seconds, something that you can offer to move forward on that, in not as an answer, but as a way to continue conversation, which will extend beyond this moment.
I'll probably only need 10 seconds. I think questions unite us and answers divide us. So to have us attempt in 30 seconds an answer is a big mistake, because right away there'll be other answers against it. I think to build on questions is to go into the Jewish community, mainstream as you possibly can, and a lot of us have a lot of problems keeping a foot in the mainstream so that we can be heard, and require full spectrum discussions. Require no shutdowns. No, we're not going to allow people to come to Birthright if they're going to criticize the occupation. No, you can't come to Hillel and speak about so-and-so. No, our synagogue won't let Sari Noseba come to speak. Open discussion so that, in fact, we can hear from people how we should answer these questions. Because we won't if we're just getting the party line. We're getting the party line. That is not the Jewish community. Despite everything, they always said about Jews, we earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. And it still holds. It still holds if you look at our vote. But it's not going to hold much longer if the Republicans keep doing this divisive stuff and if our own community shuts down open discussion.
Well, I think continuing to find places where we're not welcome and bringing these conversations to those places, and especially bringing in the younger generation and making sure that we can have some dialogues that, again, are uncomfortable and difficult. So, being not a guest, but being a speaker, and I think silence is the most perilous thing. Again, speaking from a historical point of view, remaining silent in the midst of a difficult, uncomfortable situation only results in a worsening of the situation and losing voice. And we need to have that voice. Voices, that's the other thing I get from, to answer your question, Karen, the multiplicity of presentations, Marla, diversity, that's the only way to go forward.
Tremendous feminist, radical, brave coalition work is happening in Israel and Palestine, and we can lift that up.
I would just emphasize education. Educate yourself, educate others continuously, never give hope, and speak up. I think it's really important to bring the narrative and make other people and us listen better.
Thank you so much, this panel. To the folks raising the questions, what does it show? So first of all, that when you ask really hard questions, when you try and deal with history and the present, an hour and a half will never do it. So, it's hard, though. It's like we have to bite the bullet and really have this conversation, but there are all kinds of obstacles to doing that and fears around it. So realize, why these don't happen, and yet you feel how important it is, to have it in a time where we can do justice to it. So I apologize that we can't, but I thank you for making this effort. I want to recommend to everybody Joyce's chapter in this book, which actually really, to understand, I think, just the complications of the weaving of feminism and these questions, does an amazing job. And it's just an introduction to the complications of this conversation. One introduction to it, but I think a really invaluable one. Okay, so we're over time. That's fine. We're going to take, but that means we have to take a very short break. I'm going to say 5 minutes. We have a really important conversation that I know will take up some of these and other hard issues, so we want to get to that. Thank you.